I woke up to the smell of burning oil and the sight of a damned bonfire in my front yard. Except it wasn't a bonfire. It was my tractor, Bessie. My beautiful, hard-working Bessie. Now a flaming sacrifice to the homeowner association. Which, until this very moment, I had only considered a minor inconvenience. I stood there barefoot in the wet grass, my robe flapping in the morning wind, as I watched the last 20 years of rust, grease, and good memories turn to smoke. And on the sidewalk a small group of smugly grinning homeowner association members, murmuring among themselves as if they'd just done the neighborhood a favor. The one in front, their queen, stood tall, her arms folded over her ridiculously expensive blazer, her expression distorted into something between fake sympathy and sheer pride. Cynthia Fairweather, the self-appointed ruler of Oak Estates. She looked at me as if I were a stray dog that had just soiled her marble floors. "This is what happens, Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice dripping with the artificial sweetness of someone who enjoys delivering bad news. "When people refuse to follow community guidelines." My fingers curled into a fist. Not because I was the kind of man who solved problems that way. I wasn't. But because the rage boiling inside me had nowhere else to go. The other homeowner association members shifted uncomfortably as I took a step forward, my eyes locked on Cynthia's. "You burned my tractor." My voice was calm, but the weight of the words could have shattered steel. Cynthia blinked, then forced a smile. "It was a community decision. You were given ample opportunity to remove that eyesore from your yard. We enforce aesthetic harmony in Oak, and unfortunately, you left us no choice." A slow breath escaped me. My heart pounded, but my mind was already moving past the flames, past the smell of burning rubber and gas, past the smug faces of these self-absorbed idiots. I turned on my heel, walked back inside, and shut the door. Not a word, not a scream, not a threat. Cynthia probably thought she had won, that I had accepted my punishment like a naughty child, and would now fall in line. She had no idea she had just declared battle. In my office I reached into an old storage chest. Dust rose as I lifted, the lid revealing a neatly folded uniform, a badge, and a thick binder of fire codes. A slow grin spread across my face, because while these homeowner association clowns thought they were above the law, they had no idea who they just crossed. I had spent 30 years as a fire marshal, and I knew one universal truth. Every neighborhood homeowner association is a fire hazard waiting to happen. And now it was about to make their lives miserable. It all started 3 weeks earlier when I first got the letter, a nicely typed, pretentious little notice with the homeowner association's stupid tree logo in the corner. "Dear Mr. Calloway, as a resident of Oak Estates, you are required to comply with all community guidelines set forth by the Homeowner Association. We have noticed several violations on your property, including, but not limited to, an unauthorized, worn-out agricultural vehicle parked in public view, a failure to maintain aesthetically pleasing landscaping in accordance with neighborhood expectations, repeated failure to register as a homeowner association member despite multiple invitations. Please remit the attached membership fee and ensure compliance with all homeowner association regulations by the end of the month. Failure to do so will result in escalating enforcement measures. Sincerely, Cynthia Fairweather, Homeowner Association President." I had laughed out loud. I wasn't a member of the Homeowner Association. I had lived here before. There was a homeowner association. My land, my house, my rights. This whole nonsense about escalating enforcement measures sounded like a toddler throwing a tantrum with a dictionary. I had ignored the letter. Then they started sending more, slipping them under my door, sticking them to my truck's windshield. One time, it found one taped to my dog. Then they started showing up in person. Cynthia along with her enforcer, Greg Whitmore, a walking, talking suburban nightmare who took his role as compliance officer a little too seriously. They came to my porch one Saturday afternoon, standing like they were about to perform an intervention. "Mr. Calloway," Cynthia had said in her very best "I'm being patient, but not really" tone. "I assumed you've received our notices." "I have," I said, leaning against the railing, and I took a sip of my beer. Didn't read them. Her nostrils flared just a little. Greg cleared his throat. You are in violation of multiple homeowner association policies. Sir, he gestured to my yard like a crime scene investigator presenting proof. Your lawn exceeds the allowed blade height by 2 inches. Your mailbox is not regulation standard, and that. He pointed dramatically at Bessie. My tractor is an unregistered agricultural vehicle? I stared at him. It's a tractor, Greg sighed. It does not meet aesthetic standards for a modern residential area. I took another sip. Aesthetic standards? We live in a town where someone built a 12-foot metal rooster in their front yard. That's art. But my tractor is an eyesore. Cynthia pursed her lips. Mr. Calloway, if you do not join the homeowner association and comply with its regulations, we will be forced to take action. I had waved them off laughing, and now Bessie was a pile of rubble. The flames had died down, but the rage inside me hadn't. I spent the afternoon collecting evidence. I took photos. I checked my security cameras. I recorded everything. Because while they thought this was some petty little neighborhood dispute, I knew exactly what laws they had just broken. Vandalism, property damage, harassment, conspiracy. I placed a call to an old friend at the fire department. I need a formal fire safety assessment of Oak Estates. I said, every violation, every offense. Something going on, Hank? Let's just say, I muttered, staring out at the burned remains of my tractor. Some folks here haven't been playing by the rules. I had spent my career putting out fires, now was about to start one the next morning. I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee watching the homeowner association patrol. Greg Whitmore and a couple of clueless volunteers walking the neighborhood like they were conducting a military operation, clipboards in hand. They paused every few houses, jotting down whatever ridiculous violations they could find, ready to slap residents with another round of pointless penalties. I had seen their type before, people who never had any real power in their lives, now obsessed with the tiny bit they had managed to scrape together through paperwork and intimidation. They reminded me of the kind of firefighters we used to mock in training, the ones who got excited about writing up reports but panicked when they had to actually do the job. Greg, dressed in his usual pressed polo and khakis like some suburban tyrant, stopped in front of my house and made a show of shaking his head, pretending to scribble something down. I just sipped my coffee and waved. He looked irritated that I wasn't reacting. That was fine, because soon he and his little gang of rule enforcers were about to have much bigger problems than my lawn. I spent most of the morning going through my notes, compiling every fire code violation I could find in Oak Estate. And it didn't take long. These people had no idea how much of their so-called aesthetic perfection was a disaster waiting to happen. Unapproved propane tanks stacked too close to homes, wooden fences built too high, creating an uncontrollable fire spread risk, hydrants blocked by decorative landscaping, fire lanes narrowed down to the point where a fire truck wouldn't even be able to get through. It was almost impressive how badly they had failed. The irony was so thick, I could choke on it. They burned my tractor for community safety while living in what was essentially a giant tinderbox. I called my old buddy Captain Riley from the fire department and asked him if he was interested in a little tour of a neighborhood that had seemingly forgotten what fire codes were. Riley laughed and said he'd send a team out within the week. That was all I needed, because while Cynthia and her minions were busy policing mailbox colors and lawn heights, they were about to get a surprise visit from people who actually had real power. Later that evening, I received an envelope in the mail, slipped under my door like a ransom note. Inside was a notice stamped in big bold letters. Final warning. Underneath it, the same nonsense about non-compliance and escalating enforcement. Except this time they weren't just threatening fines, they were threatening legal action, possible eviction from the community for refusing to uphold standards. I had to laugh. Eviction from my house? The house I had lived in before this neighborhood even had a homeowner association. Cynthia must have finally lost her sanity, but that was fine. She wanted to play legal games. I knew the rules better than she did. That night, I sat back in my chair watching security footage of the moment Bessie went up in flames. I zoomed in frame by frame until I caught what I was looking for. A flicker of movement, a figure too close to the tractor right before the fire started. I rewound, sharpened the image, and there it was. Greg Whitmore, his smug face barely visible in the glow of the flames. I grinned. The next day, Oak Estates was thrown into turmoil when Riley and his team of inspectors showed up unannounced. Fire trucks lined the street as uniformed officials started taking notes, measuring hydrant distances, and marking hazards with bright red labels. Homeowners peered out their windows, puzzled, watching as their perfect little paradise was dissected like a crime scene. Cynthia stormed outside demanding answers, but Riley just flashed his badge and informed her that a formal inspection was underway. That's the thing about fire code violations, there's no debate, no appeals process. When something's a hazard, it gets fixed or the city shuts you down. Greg, realizing what was happening, tried to sneak away, but I caught him before he could make it to his car, you know, I said casually, leaning against the driver's side door. Arson is a pretty serious crime. His face twitched. I don't know what you're talking about. I pulled out my phone, playing the security footage. The blood drained from his face as he watched himself in the grainy night vision, standing too close to my tractor, the flicker of a lighter in his hand just before the fire erupted. I smirked. I do. Greg mumbled something about misunderstanding, about it being an accident, about how he was just there to make sure my property was properly cleared. I let him ramble, watching him dig himself deeper into the hole. Then I gave him a decision. Either he confessed, or I turned the footage over to the fire department and let them handle it. He chose the former, of course, muttering out some nonsense about following orders. An hour later, Cynthia called an emergency homeowner association meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but that didn't stop me from showing up. I walked in just as the board was arguing about how to handle the violations. Some of the more reasonable members were panicked, realizing that their cozy positions in the neighborhood hierarchy were now at risk. Cynthia, red-faced and furious, was trying to downplay everything, insisting they could fight this. I cleared my throat. The room fell silent. Looks like you've got a real mess on your hands, I said, slipping my hands in my pockets. Violations, fines, potential criminal charges, not to mention the little arson problem you've got running around. Cynthia straightened, fixing her expression into one of forced composure. Mr. Calloway, this is a private meeting. I smirked. Yeah, and that's a private hydrant out there with a tree planted directly in front of it. We all got problems. One of the newer board members, someone with at least half a functioning brain, nervously cleared his throat. What do you want? I leaned forward. I want you to quit. All of you. Dismantle the homeowner association before it collapses on its own. Cynthia scoffed. That will never happen. I nodded. All right, then. I'll just let this fire inspection report go public. Let the city start handing out citations. Let the state fire marshal's office start digging into whether or not you've been falsifying safety records. And, oh, I pulled out my phone again, pressing play on the video of Greg. I'll just leave this little evidence with the authorities. Silence. Cynthia's jaw clenched. The others shifted, their carefully built empire crumbling around them. I saw it in their faces. The realization that they weren't running the neighborhood anymore, that they had never really had authority at all. Cynthia's voice was barely a murmur when she spoke. You'll regret this. I shrugged. You burned my tractor. She stood there, boiling as I walked out the door. I didn't need to stay for the vote. I already knew how it would go the morning after. The Emergency Homeowner Association meeting Oak Estates felt different. The usual self-important air of the neighborhood, the one that always carried the distant sound of lawnmowers, barking dogs, and nosy neighbors peering through their curtains, was now filled with something else. Unease. The homeowner association had ruled this place like a dictatorship for years, and now their foundation was crumbling beneath them. The fire department's investigation had spread like wildfire. Every homeowner had either received a citation, a warning, or an official order to fix something on their property. The same people who used to gloat about how the homeowner association kept things in order were now frantic, realizing the organization they so proudly Served had betrayed them in the worst way possible. The fines alone were enough to make some of them break down on their front lawns. I watched it all with my morning coffee, taking in the slow downfall of a regime that had gotten far too comfortable. By noon, the real damage was showing. Word had gotten out about Greg's little crime, and while the Homeowner Association Board was desperately trying to keep it under wraps, the neighborhood had turned into a chattering storm of rumors and anger. No one wanted to be associated with criminals, and certainly not a board that let it happen in the first place. I knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks split wide open. It came faster than expected. A news crew showed up, some local reporter with perfectly styled hair and a fake smile stood outside the Homeowner Association office, microphone in hand, delivering a story that I knew would destroy Cynthia and her followers. Residents of Oak Estates are in shock after a former Fire Marshal exposed major safety violations and alleged acts of arson within the Homeowner Association. The camera panned to a group of neighbors, some confused, some angry, muttering among themselves. A few of them looked ready to revolt. One woman, clutching a fire hazard citation, practically snarled into the microphone. "We paid these people to keep things safe, and now we're all stuck with fines and a bunch of illegal fire traps. What the hell were they even doing all these years?" The news crew tried to get a statement from Cynthia, but she refused to come. Outside, barricading herself in the office like some kind of cornered war general. I could have left it alone right there. The situation spiral on its own. But there was still one last card to play. I spent the afternoon going over my footage, again making sure everything was solid. The security camera's timestamp was clear as day. Greg the Flames, the smug look on his face before he realized how much danger he was in. I compiled everything, video, citations, reports, and forwarded it straight to the fire department, the local police, and just for good measure, the city council. By the time I finished, I sat back, exhaling slowly. It was done. That night, the Homeowner Association office was set ablaze. I woke up to flashing lights and the sound of sirens blaring through the neighborhood. Fire trucks lined the street as flames consumed the very building that had housed all of Cynthia's rules, fines, and illusions of power. A crowd had gathered, watching in a mix of horror and curiosity. Some people whispered among themselves, half convinced it was some sort of karma. Others openly speculated about who did it. But I already knew, Greg. It was too perfect. The man had already torched one thing in his blind loyalty to Cynthia. Why not go all in? Maybe he thought he could destroy the records. Maybe he wanted to send a message. Or maybe he had just finally collapsed under the weight of it all. But none of it mattered anymore. Because the second the flames were put out, the police were already waiting. Greg tried to make a run for it, but he wasn't exactly the fastest type. They tackled him to the pavement before he even made it halfway down the street. And Cynthia, she wasn't much better off. The next morning, the police arrived at her doorstep with an arrest warrant. Conspiracy, fraud, mismanagement. Her laundry list of violations had finally caught up with her. As she was let out in cuffs, the neighborhood stood outside watching in dead silence. No one cheered. No one shouted. They just stared as the woman who had made their lives miserable was stuffed into the back of a squad car, burning with rage, but powerless to do a thing about it. As she was driven away, our eyes met through the car window. She didn't say a word, but her expression said it all. This isn't over, but it was. The next few weeks passed like a blur. The city officially disbanded the Homeowner Association, citing gross misconduct and legal failures. The board members who hadn't been arrested resigned in shame, their reputations destroyed beyond repair. The neighborhood itself felt light, like a burden had been lifted. People who had never spoken to each other were suddenly chatting, sharing stories about their conflicts with the Homeowner Association, laughing over old feuds. Some folks even started repainting their houses whatever wild color they wanted, like some sort of suburban revolt. I just sat back and watched it unfold, pleased with the chaos I had helped create. One afternoon, as I worked on my new tractor, Bessie 2.0, a beauty of a machine, with more horsepower than I probably needed, Captain Riley showed up. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed, shaking his head. "You know," he said, In all my years, I've never seen a fire marshal single-handedly take down an entire homeowner association. I grinned, wiping my hands on a rag. Guess there's a first time for everything, he laughed. We got the final reports back. Turns out the homeowner association had been fudging safety inspections for years. The city's not just shutting them down, they're considering a complete redevelopment of the whole neighborhood. I raised an eyebrow. So what you're saying is I helped make the place safer, something like that? He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Listen, Hank, you ever think about getting back into it? We could use a guy like you. Maybe not full-time, but as an advisor. I glanced at my tractor, at the quiet street, at the people finally free from the nonsense that had controlled their lives for so long. I smirked. Well, I said, seeing as I just saved an entire neighborhood, why not? And just like that, Oak Estates became something different. Free.